Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a surprise, just like Lexington, Concord, and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising were surprises, a surprise This Day in Liberty History live stream. We are LPA Alliance and Inter-Caucus Coalition dedicated to rebuilding and revolutionizing the Libertarian Party. And today we have a revolutionary story for you all. Lexington and Concord. Yes, finally, we are in America. All right, so we're going to be talking about an American revolutionary story. But before we begin, we would like to thank Crown News Network for sponsoring this very not propagandistic segment today.
So get yourself a cup of tea and a bottle of water. Enjoy the broadcast. Now, it's been 250 years since the point of no return for America, and we all know how the story began. But for a brief prologue, this is a tale about having a divine mandate and having a job to do, essentially. Colonists in America wanted to send King George more of their money because they were basically sick of deciding for themselves what to do with their own incomes. And they sought to enrich King George and have decisions made for them. Peace through strength was a common phrase at the time, which essentially meant by bolstering the largest military empire in the world, they could advance liberty, which checks out today.
Yes, so to appease the colonists who wanted very much to be paying more money to King George, the good king put a tariff on all tea, except for the best tea you could get anywhere. That is tea from British East India Trading Company. That wasn't enough, however. The colonists were very, very concerned about bringing peace to the world, and they really wanted King George to take even more of their money. So they protested. They protested because they weren't giving the king enough of their money. They threw a bunch of tea into the harbor, and that was a way to let England know that the king's defense budget was very important to them.
Now, King George was a very smart man with very big hands.
Big hands.
And he knew that America wasn't profitable for his empire, but he was also kind of proud, and admitting mistakes is for peasants, not really for his majesty.
Mm-hmm.
So he concocted a brilliant strategy. Instead of admitting that his family had made a poor financial gamble in creating the colonies, he intentionally started a war to give the colonies their independence and freed Britain of its problem child.
That is 5-star parenting. That really is.
Mm-hmm.
King George just does great things. He sent a few dozen soldiers to Boston. Likewise, he sent the wives, the colonists. They were so elated at this that they invited the soldiers that King George sent to Boston, these manly British men, because nothing says masculinity like bad teeth, invited them to stay in their homes and even to sleep in their beds. There were small sacrifices, but they were worth it to carry out the king's mandate, because everything should be given a chance to play out. That's what we here at Crown News Network believe. And sometimes it's difficult for underlings to see that the grandmaster strategy is indeed at play, because we can't all be wizards at 4D chess.
Now, the rural folk were totally opposed to the scandalous lifestyle engaged by the Bostonians. They began stockpiling weapons and gunpowder inspired by Catholic terrorists nearly 200 years ago who tried to blow up Parliament. General Gage, commander of the British soldiers in Boston, decided that these farming peasants needed to be put down before things got dangerous. Peace through strength. You know,
so you do need to put down the peasants. That's one thing that I think we've learned throughout all this time, is that the peasants need to be put down. They were rebel terrorists. You know, oftentimes actually peasant revolts before the start of the 20th century, most of the revolts were peasant revolts, and that's true. They're rebel terrorists. They're being led by a contraband smuggler and a money launderer and a bandit and a thief named John Hancock. They're being led as well by a preacher's son, radicalized by leftist Harvard. That's Sam Adams. This is the guy who made the beer. Gage knew that bringing the head of the snake in would restore peace, and his soldiers could return home to the colonists' wives, providing free room and board and other things as well for them. They were holed up in a brief march away from Lexington, a village of about 1,000 residents. It's 12 miles from liberal Pinko, Boston.
So it's April 19th, 1775, and Gage had other shit to do that day. So he sent out a platoon under his the command of his Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. They were tasked with marching to Concord to destroy weapons of mass destruction, stopping through Lexington on the way to arrest the terrorist ringleaders for questioning. But of course, as corruptible as the colonists were, there were snitches in the midst. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode ahead of the column, and for reasons known only to them, spoiled the news of the king's surprise visitors.
I have to say, General Gage has an incredibly stately chin. You see that? That is...
Yes.
And you see that Sam Adams is trying to SWF that chin and failing.
He's trying to steal that swag. That's what he's trying to do. He's a swag jacker.
Terribly. Absolutely a bandit and a thief and a swag jagger. That was what I couldn't remember earlier. There was these unsubstantiated reports that indicated that the wife of General Gage of the notable chin, Margaret Gage, also leaked the date of the British expedition to Concord, the colonists and the rebels. And these are most likely, of course, fanciful imaginings of a revolutionary mindset, not at all true.
Yes. At dawn, the king's troops reached Lexington. The terror cell ringleaders, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, they're not really fighters. They're mostly administrators, and they didn't want to face the king's justice, so they fled. But in their stead stood a small band of liberal extremists. They had been led astray by a Captain John Parker and were blocking traffic on the road. According to survivors of the impending terrorist attack, these men had all exited the local tavern together, and their leader, Captain Parker, told his violent bandits to stand their ground and cause trouble if the king's men tried to press on. It was at this moment that an acorn fell onto a nearby carriage, startling the rebels. The felled acorn sounded like a gunshot to them, so they opened fire on the forward guard. And of course, defending themselves, the guardsmen put down 17 rebels in a single volley and scattered the rest. Fun fact, that revolutionary acorn eventually grew into a tree that was cut down by a drunken Woodrow Wilson and used for paper to sign the income tax into law.
Definitely true. You know, these are lawbreakers. They broke the law.
Yes.
They broke the law, and so they should be punished. And so as a libertarian and nearly an anarchist, I fully endorse the sanctioning of these lawbreakers by the king, because libertarians believe in that sort of thing. When you break the law, you suffer the hand of justice. By the way, I did not know that Paul Revere was related to Jack Black. Now, after a quick regroup, the King's Guard set off to Concord to destroy the weapons of the mass destruction that had just been used against them. We are libertarians, and we frown quite a bit upon people holding weapons of mass destruction. At about 7 a.m., they reached Concord and began their search. Due to the alarm of spies, the illegal arms had already been moved. While guarding a bridge during the search, 5 times as many rebels assembled as had in Lexington. And this is the thing. I don't know why people block traffic. It never, ever gets any traction for a movement. Now, they formed ranks, murdering 3 British soldiers in an unprovoked attack. Some witnesses claim that the British soldiers felled on the bridge were subsequently scalped. I don't know whether that's true, but I don't know that it isn't. Bolstered by the massacre of British troops, thousands of rebels and thieves and bandits and vagabonds began to form ranks against the king's defense forces, and finding no weapons other than those being used to fire upon them and being outnumbered and low on ammunition, Colonel Smith ordered a tactical reverse, marched back to Boston. Very tactical, very brave.
Yeah, it wasn't a retreat. It was a tactical reverse, because retreating isn't what the king's men do. During the 15-mile march back to safety, the rebels continued to fight very ungentlemanly-like. They are now hiding behind trees and sheds and ambushing the troops as they trace back through Lexington once more. General Gage was still busy with other things that day, but he did send 1,000 reinforcements under the command of Lord Percy to assist the battered troops fleeing Concord. These reinforcements trolled the colonists by chanting the hymn Yankee Doodle as they marched from Boston to Lexington to assist.
The Lord Percy had no choice but to leave behind his spare ammunition and several cannons under light guard to quickly advance his units to Lexington to save Colonel Smith, who was being very brave. The Smith was currently being hunted down by a wild mob of vagabonds and terrorists. To his dismay, elderly colonial rebel units in their 60s ambushed this light guard and stole the ammo supply dump and the cannons.
Yeah, that's why you can't trust the elderly. In the end, 273 of the king's troops never made it back to Boston, and 15,000 rebels were now surrounding the city. The reckless actions of these rebels only lengthened the time it would take for America to gain its independence, which was the king's plan all along. Their actions needlessly drug Europe into war shortly thereafter, and thankfully, the revolution is remembered on July 4th instead for a town hall meeting. Final thoughts.
Final thoughts. All right. We have the Second Amendment because of this wonderful escapade in our history. Don't give up your firearms, because otherwise none of this could have been possible.
That's right. Don't fuck with America, and don't be afraid to start a revolution against a hostile government.
That is
are
correct.
My final thoughts on this. Okay.
Absolutely. Do you think, oh, by the way, I have to ask, do you think that all the libertarians in the Libertarian Party today would be in favor of the Americans, the Battle of Lexington and Concord?
No, not all of them.
No. Well, I mean, I suppose if the Hoppianism is consensual, then you do need a strong man at the top, don't you, to pull the strings?
Yeah. They feel safer under the king's leadership. All right. So now that concludes our sponsored segment from Crown News Network. Thanks again. And now we have a serious segment coming up right after this.
Yes. All right.
Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, April 19th, 1943.
Yes.
So basically, this story starts with the Nazis, literal Nazis.
Literal Nazis, not like the Nazis as in people online that you don't like, actual Nazis.
Yes. And they've taken power with only 32% of the vote, essentially, which is kind of scary.
How does that happen?
How exactly does that happen? Well, Hitler was convincing to 32% of the people they voted for Nazis to be in the German legislator. I forgot what it was actually called, but and then essentially, I guess the German Chancellor Bismarck. Well, no, it wasn't Bismarck, was it?
It wasn't Bismarck. Yeah, that was the last. Yeah,
that was like 50 years earlier. No, that was like
we did that one.
Yeah, that was like 70 years earlier.
Yes.
Who was it? He was Hindenburg.
Yes.
Hindenburg was like, yo, why don't you just be, the Chancellor of Germany, Hitler? Like whatever. And that was probably a bad call for, world history there.
Probably.
But essentially, let's see here, in September 1939, Germany basically invades Poland and kicks off World War II.
Initially, there is an agreement between the Germans and the Soviets that just allows Hitler to do this. There's a non-aggression pact. So, and initially, it is both the Soviets and the Germans that are helping to barrage Poland.
Yes, the Soviets get in a couple of weeks after Germany invades and takes the eastern half, and the Polish army basically is screwed and loses. So afterwards, the literal Nazis decide they're going to round up the Jewish populations and ghettoize them. This was made easy. Oh,
I was going to say this was already easier because for the most part, the Jewish populations were already living in very close quarters and were sequestered from the rest of the population. However, during the partitioning of the actual ghettos themselves, almost as many Poles were displaced, ethnic Poles, as Jews because of the proximity in which they were living. So you had almost an equal level of displacement.
Yes, and they crammed 500,000 people into 840 acre area. So that's basically enough room for every room in that area had 9 people in it, essentially on average. So there's not enough space for water. There's not enough space for food, sanitation. There's no economy. There's no currency. This has reduced the population to a barter economy. Everybody was unemployed. And the Nazis' plan at this point was basically to keep their options open and to use the Jewish population for slave labor in nearby factories.
Now, at the same time, however, go on.
I was just gonna say, I guess the Nazis had a conference at this point, and they decided that their plan was to deport the Jewish populations, but America and the Britain apparently opposed that. There's a poll that showed that 67% of the American population at the time thought that Jewish immigrants would be secret German spies and would commit acts of terrorism. So they sent the Jewish refugees back to Europe. And I thought this was an interesting tidbit that 67% of Americans also regarded the students getting shot at Kent State protesting the Vietnam War was justified when they did a poll right after it occurred. So 67% of Americans kind of are downers.
It was the same 67%. Actually, no, we don't know that for
yeah.
At the same time, in the ghetto, there were self-managing communities. So one thing that did end up happening was this desire to preserve the intellectual life of the community in the ghetto. And there were secret groups that were organized as canteens. And the premise was you'd come in and you'd get a bowl of soup every day. But all the while at these canteens, there were also cultural and educational activities being had. People were writing and publishing regular reports on what ended up becoming the deportations in occupied Poland. There were even reports on mass exterminations that were sent to the exiled Polish government in the UK. You mentioned the 67% of Americans that thought that Jews would be German spies. There was, in fact, early knowledge of the fact that there were concentration camps, and these were not just concentration camps, these were extermination camps. There was early knowledge that there was early documentation sent in the form of a telegram to initially the American administration and then back to the British administration. The American administration didn't want to panic the public. And so they didn't release this information that there were extermination camps and there were exterminations of Jews taking place across Europe. This was also relayed again to the British, and the British government also did not want to panic the public. So there was early knowledge of the fact that there were extermination camps against the Jews. And in order to avoid a panic, the exterminations were not reacted to or disclosed for a couple years.
So yes, after the Jewish population is sent back, the Nazis have another conference, which you're saying, and next time they're going to kill them, and they're building death camps. They don't want the ghetto population to know that what's about to happen to them. So they're essentially telling them that they conquered a bunch of land out east and the Soviet Union's collapsed, and they want them to just go live out there and be settlers, essentially.
Which is like not, by the way, for those who don't know, not an incredibly disbelievable thing in Jewish history. Like basically, you're just told, okay, we're sending you somewhere else now, and you have to go and move somewhere else.
Right.
So that was normal. That was a Tuesday.
Right. And of course, there are no new colonies out east. Germany's getting their ass kicked, kind of. They're going to a death camp called Treblinka. So
there were also at the time, they were promising that anyone who voluntarily went on these wagons were going to get 3 kilos of bread, 1 kilo of marmalade, and that was a big deal. All the food stores, food supplies were essentially cut off in Warsaw, to the point that there were children who would work as smugglers and would go out into the city, steal food, and come back and bring it in, occasionally get stopped by the SS guards. And that was how they survived, that you had smugglers, which is also very good for propaganda, because the entire bit was that the Jews were stealing from hardworking people, right? So the way to make that true is by forcing that to be true, to have children who literally, in order to survive, needed to go and smuggle food back into the ghetto. And you'll see on these reports, the Jews that are killed during the uprising are referred to as bandits.
So basically, the Jews find out that this is bullshit. That there's no colonies out east. They're getting sent to their deaths, and since they know they're gonna die, and they know they might not even kill a lot of Nazis, but they're gonna pick the way they die, and they're going to go into this genocide on their own terms. So they decide that they're gonna resist.
There were two groups, by the way. So there was a left-wing group and a right-wing group. A left-wing Zionist movement and then a right-wing, more nationalist movement that came together and fought alongside one another, these two Jewish resistance movements, in order to plan and execute the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which lasted longer than Kronstadt, which is interesting because Kronstadt, they were fortified to the teeth. Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, not so much. And it lasted almost a month.
Right. One group was called the ZZW, and that was the Jewish Military Union. And this group was more pro-Western allies. They worked with the Polish Home Guard. They had about 600 soldiers, and they were slightly better armed, but not like particularly better armed. And then the second group was the ZOB, the Jewish Combat Organization. And like you were mentioning, this was like a leftist socialist pro-Soviet group. They were Zionist, 400 soldiers to begin with, essentially. And I thought it was interesting that that these two groups were, even though they knew that they were all probably about to die, they were still concerned about the future, and whether it was going to be a future of socialism or a future of capitalism.
That's what I'd like. I'd like to just be concerned with that until the end. I'm not being sarcastic. I want that. I want those to be my last thoughts, are just about like the future market economy of the world. Absolutely.
Right. So they're both underarmed. They didn't have hardly any rifles. They didn't have any machine guns. They had some Molotov cocktails, a rare hand grenade, some revolvers. And that's basically what they're working with. Their plan was essentially to kill Nazis and take the Nazis' weapons and start using those to defend themselves.
Yes, so eventually, well, they organized this uprising. Once again, Devin, as you mentioned, there was never any thinking that they were going to be victorious. It was just a way of saying that you resist to the last, and if this is the only way to take charge of your destiny, then this is the only way to take charge of your destiny.
Yes.
So they knew that it was fated, and continued to fight and took out some people with them as well. There was also in the middle of all of this, there was also a front group, or rather an agent provocateur group, essentially, that the Germans installed, that pretended to be this Jewish resistance movement, but that were just German spies, and they got found out too, which was kind of interesting.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So the Polish resistance didn't really help the Jews that much. I mean, they did help that one organization a little bit, but not really. They mostly had to rely on the black market to get their ammunition, and obviously they're getting ripped off. The propaganda being fed to the Polish people by the Nazis was essentially that the Jews were Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks were shipping weapons to the ghetto. So it's basically, they're saying it's dangerous, stay away, don't mess with them.
Right.
So
they ended up resisting for about a month. Ultimately, killed very few Nazis. But and then on the first day, the Nazis killed a couple of hundred fighters in the ghetto. Again, in all of the documents, all of the Nazi documentation, these are listed as bandits, and that's some of the propaganda that's going around, that we're killing these people because they're bandits and they're stealing.
Right. The Nazis actually tried to go in before April 19th. I think it was in January. And then the resistance basically threw a bunch of Molotov cocktails at their vehicles. They managed to take one out. Like you were saying, the resistance only killed about a dozen Nazis on this first encounter, and the Nazis killed a couple hundred of them. But the Nazis were freaked out by this because they weren't expecting it at all. So they literally had to fall back and like plan for a couple months on what to do the second go around, which is April 19th, 1943. So they fired the commander who led the first go around, and the second one was a lot more brutal. And he doesn't even want to bring vehicles into Warsaw Ghetto. He thinks that it would be better just to literally use artillery and demolition charges and go building to building and blow up every single building until the entire ghetto is leveled.
Yeah.
So they take basically 2 months to plan all this,
including the synagogue. That was the biggest thing that they wanted to do, is they wanted to destroy the synagogue in the middle of the ghetto, which they saved for last.
Yes. So during this 2 months, the Jewish resistance is digging tunnels. They're established kind of a fortress in the sewer system, and they've even got escape routes out of the ghetto from the sewer system. They stored what food and arms they had in the sewer system as well. And essentially, they'd pop out of basements and manholes and use trenches that they've built and fortified like holdouts in the houses to attack the Nazis as they're going house to house and blowing everything up. There's at this time, there's about 1,000 resistance fighters, and there's 50,000 civilians of the initial 500,000 left in the city still.
Right. And as you mentioned, they're going room to room, they're going house to house, and flattening everything, and that goes on for about 10 days. The ZZW, for its part, is completely dead, including all of the commanders, and some escape through the tunnels to join the Polish resistance.
Yes. The ZOB stays and fights to the end. None of them try to escape. But after about 10 days, they've all suffocated from the smoke. Apparently, the largest percentage of the casualties was from smoke from the fires. I mean, after starvation.
There were also plenty who committed suicide rather than being killed by the Nazis, either in the moment or at the camps. Drank cyanide or took cyanide and committed suicide.
Building right there in that bottom right corner in that picture, that was the Last Stand building, apparently. Where when the Nazis finally were breached, they decided to commit suicide instead of be captured. Mm-hmm. And in the end, the Nazis capture 13,000 are killed there. 43,000 are essentially taken to be killed later. And then we actually have some firsthand survivors who are actually there, and we have their interviews from the Nuremberg trials. So I figure we can just listen to their testimony in their own words for a little bit.
These are the two women, is that correct?
Yeah.
As a fun fact, so this was a movement in which there were a whole lot of women that were organized as well, and who played a key role in a lot of the uprising.
All right, here we go.
We moved from classic street fighting to attacks carried out by smaller units. We divided ourselves into several groups, which hid at strategic points in these buildings at night and waited for the Germans. During the first days, we had the upper hand. We knew the terrain, the buildings, the hiding places and attics and cellars that the Germans didn't know.
Dla żobu osiągnięciem jest to, że oni wytrwają trochę.
All right, and then here is the continued on from that.
For those wondering, that is the trial of Adolf Eichmann. It's the guy who was sitting there.
For months, these boys and girls had been waiting to shoot at the Germans. Now, that moment had arrived. At daybreak, I was at 23 Nalewki Street. I saw thousands of Germans entering the ghetto with machine guns, as if they were going to fight on the Russian front. And what were our weapons? We each had a revolver and a grenade. There were 2 rifles for the entire group. We also had homemade bombs that we lit with matches and Molotov cocktails.
Sevia was one of 300 to 500 poorly armed insurgents from the Jewish Combat Organization.
All right, and then I got one last one.
The entire sky of Warsaw was red, completely red. But the flames were so concentrated around the whole ghetto that it illuminated the whole city. The next week, the same week, was Palm Sunday. I couldn't be anymore with my parents in the hiding. I walked out on that Palm Sunday and I went to Plac Kraszinski, where there was a church, a very old church, and I felt that my safest place is in the church. I went to that church and I attended the Mass, and the priest spoke. Not a word was mentioned that across the street people are fighting, dying by the hundreds in fire. I was just like a good Christian listening to the whole sermon. Then it is traditional in Poland when after the services, the priest goes out in front of the church and he greets the people. Probably it's practiced here in every country the same way, but in Poland it is a traditional thing. And he greeted all the Poles. And across the street was a carousel with a playground. And the music was playing. And the carousel the people took the children on the carousel, beautifully dressed, Palm Sunday. And music was playing, and I was standing in that group, watching the other side of the block of that burning ghetto. From time to time, we heard screaming, "Look, look, people are jumping from the roofs." Others will make remarks. Jews are frying. That's just a free translation from Polish. But I never heard any sympathy voices. Maybe there were people who looked in a different way, but I never heard it. And it was very heartbreaking for me that here I'm helpless. I can't do nothing. And I gotta see and watch, and I cannot even protest. I cannot even show my anger. Sometimes I felt in the air that I have to do something physically, even have to pay with my life and start screaming, but I didn't do it. I didn't scream. I didn't do anything. I just was hurt. But that scene will probably remain with me all my life.
All right. So finally, while this is basically all going down, the Allied powers decide now they're going to discuss what to do about the Jewish suffering. And they do have airplane photos with labels from all the death camps, and they know what's happening, and they neglected to act.
to not cause a panic, because it might panic the people if they knew that there were Jews dying in camps.
So, final thoughts. My main final thought is that there's a big difference between a prison and a concentration camp. And I think that relates to what's happening in America today. A prison has due process. And if you don't have due process and you're sent to a concentration camp. And that sending people to concentration camps, even outside your home country, is a crime against humanity. And my last final thought is you should risk your own life to help persecuted people as it's happening, or you will die old in a comfortable bed with serious regrets in your life.
Yeah. Final thoughts for this. So for those who don't know, that this happened on the eve of Passover. Tonight is the last full night of Passover, and so that's why the lineup between Palm Sunday and Passover here. So clearly, some connections to the desire, right, for Jewish liberation that the first Passover commemorates, and the continuous struggle for liberation across many stories of oppression. In terms of final thoughts more generally, there were a few things that stand out to me about this story. The first has to do with the fact that while all of this was happening at these canteens that we mentioned earlier, people kept on documenting everything. Knowing that the situation was very grave, they acted preemptively to take these documents, all of these recordings, all of these memories that they had, and bury them and hide them, knowing that the ghetto probably would be razed and possessions destroyed. And a long time later, the documents were unearthed. All of the firsthand accounts of what happened during the uprising and before were revealed. And so I just think that is an incredible act of foresight to be documenting everything for future generations, not just for posterity, but for education and for edification as well. I'm also continually struck by the alliance between left and right-wing groups here. When it matters, people put aside the differences that they can work out later, and they do what's necessary to survive. Maybe that's something that we could all take into account as well. And I've recently seen people talking about the deportations and the camps in El Salvador, and it's really interesting because you wonder how people can be so blind and not even care that across the street an entire ghetto is burning and people's lives are literally burning. I think we are realizing how easy it is to look the other way and say, well, it's not happening to me, or there's a reason that it's happening. This person was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or this person was associating with the wrong people, or this person had the wrong tattoos. And end up just not caring. It's always wrong. The thing that stands out to me the most above all else, and that I continually think about, is the absolute courage to say, I know that this is on paper a losing battle. The battle is not whether I live or die. The battle is whether I am in charge of it. The battle is whether I fight. And as long as you defy to your last breath, it is not in vain. That's what stands out to me the most. That this refusal to go quietly, this refusal to go as an oppressor would like. That is something that we all need to practice. Just because something appears hopeless does not mean that you cannot create an avenue of resistance and fight to your last. And that's one of the things that I come back to again and again with the Uprising.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that concludes our episode for this evening.
Thanks, guys, for
Just wanna
hanging out with us on short notice.
Yeah.
And
I
Devin's
just
cat.
I know my cat is very needy right now. So just want to remind everybody that we do have a store and we have some new items. This is going to be at what is it? LP-alliance.com.
That is
And
an
all
amazing.
the
That is a
proceeds.
full-size flag, by the way.
Yes,
So
yes.
I have it on my back wall.
What is full size? Is that like 3x5 or something?
No,
3 by 4?
It's huge. I don't know if you can see. Look at
Oh
that.
yeah! Holy cow! Look how big that
Yeah.
is.
Woo! It's
That's
enormous.
only $26.50. That's an amazing deal.
I was actually very impressed. I thought it was going to be like a small, dinky little like American flag, whatever. Yeah.
But yeah, basically every purchase is going to put $5 into our bank account to help buy Airbnbs for Grand Rapids.
To help you.
There's a link if you want to join the alliance. There's going to be a link in the video description or on the page that you're watching this from to join. It's a Discord link. That's all for me, I think.
That is all. Thank you all so much.
That's all. Yes, thank you all for watching. Enjoy
right,
your Good Friday and your Easter Sunday.
And your last night of Pesach.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I hate.
Ты прерываешь мою работу. Что это? Расследование. Кто расследует? Почему? О, ну это не так, как выглядит. Сколько? Ну, мы работаем над привлечением большего количества клиентов, но сейчас у нас один. Только один. Отменили? Портер? Кто это? Я не знаю. Но теперь ЛНС хочет журнал вызовов для контракта LP. Журнал вызовов. Пока не звони. Я справлюсь, Деган. Или несколько настоящих звонков. Стоит обновиться. Да, нам следует стелиться более убедительным. Ну, тогда но перед этим тебе стоит стрелять несколько звонков. Настоящие звонки? Нет. Мы стреляли настоящие звонки. Это не я. Ты что думал? Я думал, я был очень занят. Это твой телефон. Да, ты можешь их? Я прокурор. Стелит я тебя. Я ненавижу свою жизнь. Товарищ Сталин? Говори, крестьянин. Это правда раздваивает. Не напиши, как я против Николай Разлучен раз. Что ты хочешь? Ну, я вложил. Можешь я тебе перестать вести себя как неудачи прогоноте? Очень хорошо. Выглядит убедительно, да? Они купят наверняка. Тебя беспокоит? Нет. Они никогда меня не уволят. Я владею той доской. Я сейчас же отправлю факс, товарищ. Как только тебя не будет, не знаю. Оформление документов завершено. Компания тебя. Удачи.
Was it recorded?